Much of Russian history is absolutely inundated with the presence and influence of Russian Orthodox Christianity. Countless Russian autocrats have been venerated as saints, and in the modern day, religious leaders actively preach about the holiness of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In turn, Russian Orthodoxy is and was heavily influenced by monasticism, a religious practice in which individuals withdraw from society and dedicate their lives to the study of Scripture in order to form a deeper understanding of God. In Russia, this practice is incredibly important because religious leaders have often been monastics, and because, historically, monasteries have filled vital roles in society left empty by the government, like giving education and medicine to the common people or supporting the rule of the autocrat. Monasticism, and female monasticism in particular, underwent a change, however, under Catherine the Great.
Catherine the Great's depth of academic interest and intellectual studies were unique among Russian rulers. In her youth, Catherine was isolated and led a reclusive life during her marriage to Peter III. She mainly occupied herself by reading books and was attracted to Enlightenment ideas. Catherine the Great exposed herself to the works of Voltaire and other French Enlightenment figures, including Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert. However, when she became more experienced in governing, she believed that natural-born rulers and other people of her rank were naturally more intelligent than common people. Catherine the Great had ambitions of being considered Peter I's equal in carrying out his efforts. She attempted to rule her people by balancing control in some areas with personal freedom in others. For example, Catherine implemented control through incredibly detailed large-scale administrative changes while also promoting greater trade, economic freedom, and some forms of self-government among peasants. She wanted to continue Peter's efforts of westernizing Russia while also protecting herself and maintaining authority over her people. Catherine the Great planned to modernize Russia's culture, military, and power by selectively adapting Western technology and educational ideas. However, the Russian Orthodox Church feared that the practice would jeopardize its hope for a complete Orthodox empire. Additionally, Catherine the Great transferred all of the Russian Orthodox Church's properties to the state and eliminated around 400 monasteries. This secularization of church lands stripped the church of most of its earnings and power. She did this to control the power of the Russian Orthodox Church from being a potential threat to the state. Catherine's elimination of monasteries and her moderate Enlightenment ideas made the church wary of her and her reforms. As Catherine aged, she became less tolerant of Enlightenment ideals. In her 60s, the French Revolution made a lasting impression on Catherine as she began to worry about the potential effects of Enlightenment ideas on monarchs. Whenever she faced opposition to plans or sensed the slightest threat to her own well-being, she would sacrifice everything in order to maintain her position of authority. She did not want to share power with anybody, and she designed her domestic policies to reinforce the absolutist state and her power. Catherine the Great's top priority was to stay in power at all costs. Under Catherine II's rule, Freemasons were persecuted for threatening her authority, vision, and command over Russia. Catherine the Great halted Freemasonry and free thinking whenever she believed that it had the potential to disrupt her legitimacy and rule by imperiling the church.
This created, over the course of Catherine's rule, several different eras of policies and reforms, both for and against religious practices. For example, she seized the lands and serfs of the church and took them under state management. She also targeted monasticism, limiting the number of monks and nuns and forcing monasteries to support themselves rather than be subsidized by the state. Later, however, she relied upon the power of the church over the people to help her maintain absolute authority and, therefore, allowed monasticism to grow once more. This sometimes supportive and sometimes contentious relationship between Catherine and the Russian Orthodox Church was significant because both parties represented vital pillars of Russian society. And, as discussed before, monasteries and convents, representatives of the church, often filled gaps left by the state government. Particularly notable was the effect that Catherine's reforms had on convents. While monasteries also underwent changes during and after this time period, convents changed more significantly, in part because of the social structures of female and male monasticism. Monks were primarily engaged in study and contemplation. They could wield religious and sometimes political power in ways that nuns could not. For example, some holy sites even barred all women, including holy women. Nuns, however, were always expected to fulfill a multitude of roles. They ran orphanages, women's shelters, hospitals, and more. When Reformation came, nuns were better equipped to innovate and adapt to the trying circumstances because they were accustomed to fulfilling more roles in society. Catherine's reforms thus reduced both the number and size of monasteries, and particularly convents, at least at first. Unable to support themselves without the lands and serfs seized by the state, many convents closed down entirely. Individual nuns were either released from service or passed into a larger convent capable of supporting them. Curiously enough, however, this low point for female monasticism in Russia did not last forever. In fact, it heralded a new period of extreme long-term growth for female monasticism. The number of convents in 1914, for example, was 7 times the number in 1764, and the number of nuns was 9.2 times the 1764 population. Monks began with a higher total population but didn't grow as quickly. By 1914, there were 73,000 nuns to 21,000 monks. The reason for this lies with Catherine and Peter the Great's reforms, the very same things that shrunk the population to begin with. Peter the Great, though his other reforms reduced the number and size of monasteries both male and female, also ordered that clerical and military widows be allowed into convents. This was the first step towards an increase in the proportion of peasants in those convents. Now, not only upper-class women could devote themselves. Catherine's reforms not only encouraged this trend of increasing proportions of peasants within female monasticism, but in fact heralded another innovation of female monastics. Convents decided to reorganize themselves in order to cope with the economic tribulations of these reforms. Centers of cloistered life shifted from cities to rural villages, and at least some reorganized their own wealth by pooling individual resources for the betterment of the community. These somewhat radical changes were extremely successful in preserving monastic life in the wake of brutal cutbacks, but appealed far less to upper-class women than lower class. The initial effect was a reduction in the total population of female monastics, but over time an increase in the number of peasant women joining female monastic communities. As peasant women far outnumbered upper-class women, this meant a long-term increase in population. It seems appropriate that one of Russia's most notorious female rulers was so impactful to Russia's underrepresented female religious groups. While the relationship between Catherine the Great and Russian Orthodoxy as a whole was often fraught with tension and desire for political power, in the end she provoked female monastics into great heights of innovation that allowed them to not only survive but thrive in the turbulence of Russian history. And that is an achievement indeed.